Welcome back. I'm Christina, the manager at the Pacific Beach Library. Thank you for joining me for day 2 of our read-along together of The Cricket on the Hearth by Charles Dickens. Today we're reading the second half of Chirp the First, which is, I gotta say, the only book in which instead of chapters I've had chirps. Makes me feel kind of chirpy. Let's see. I thought we'd start out with some tea. Today's tea is another special holiday blend. This one is called Nutcracker Sweet. Not like the piece of music by Tchaikovsky, S-U-I-T-E, but sweet like sugar, S-W-E-E-T, but no sugar needed because it already has flavorings. Let's see, this one, it says it is tell me the ingredients, celestial seasonings. So describe this as a black tea with natural vanilla flavor and other natural flavors and cinnamon. One of these days, I look forward, I mean, seriously, what's a natural flavor? Why can't you just tell us what it is? Is it a trade secret? Like, what is the natural seasoning that they're putting in there that makes it so good that they won't tell us? It is good. I gotta say that, but I'm not sure exactly what that mystery natural flavor is, but naturally, I like it. All right, let's talk a little bit about yesterday's reading. Oh, actually, little housekeeping. Always into housekeeping. Let's see. First thing I wanted to mention was that we are in the process of also choosing our next read. This is a relatively short story. We're going to read it in just 6 days. And so what I would like to do, if you don't mind, is to continue our voting. We opened it up last week, and I'm looking up across the side to my other monitor where it has where we stand in the polls right now. At present, I believe there are, I already forgot how many, like 8 titles I think that have been nominated. And the far and away leader right now is The Great Gatsby, which is just entering the public domain next year. So it'll be the first time that we could read it for free. Yay! And so that is currently in the lead. If you're okay with that, you might want to give it another vote just in case. If you're not okay with that, if you don't want to read The Great Gatsby together starting on January 11th, go in and nominate something else. Or if you see another title on the list that intrigues you, vote for that one. Otherwise, my suspicion is that next Monday we're going to announce that we're going to read The Great Gatsby starting in January. But if you want to change that, there's still time. Please go in and vote. Vote, vote, vote. Let's see. What else do we have? I feel like there's something else I wanted to mention. There probably is. We'll talk about it tomorrow. But for now, please just go ahead and vote as to what you'd like to read next. Let's see. Okay, so discussing what happened in yesterday's reading of The Cricket on the Hearth. Also, I'm curious if anyone has actually read this book before. Please give a comment. I'm curious to know if anyone has read it before, or if, for like me, this is your first time. Ooh, I see some good teas out there too. If you're having a wonderful tea and you'd like to share what it is, please go ahead and comment on that as well. So far, we have a black tea, my Nutcracker Sweet. We have Pam drinking a Tazo green ginger tea. These all sound lovely, especially on a wintry day like it's been. Like, just tea is, I think, the perfect accompaniment for the afternoon and the morning and probably the evening as well. But yeah, especially when it gets a little chilly out, the tea is just so good. All right, so what happened in yesterday's read, it was, so Chirp the First starts out, again, just like in A Christmas Carol, starts out really engaging. Dickens is very good about that, creating an opening that draws the reader in. And it starts out with our narrator basically saying, oh, the kettle. The kettle is what was doing it. Don't listen to Mrs. Peerybingle. It was the kettle. And so you're like, wait, what was it? What was the it? What was the thing? And who is this talking? So you get automatically pulled into the story. And what the narrator is doing is creating a sense of a home. Setting a scene for a very cheerful, bustling, busy little home. And what we learn is that there is, of course, a kettle that is piping on the boiling away. And meanwhile, too, the cricket joins in, the cricket, the titular cricket on the hearth, who is chiming away and chirping. And we find that there is in that home, in addition to a kettle and a cricket, that there is a wife, and that Mrs. Peerybingle, who is also known as Dot, is a young woman, a young bride, and just there's a whole lot of details about the house, like about the clock that has like they call it the haymaker on top. So they're saying it's like a figure who's probably carrying a scythe. like, to cut the hay with. And then there's, like there's this happening, there's that happening. It's a very cozy, happy little home is what the picture creates. And it's a dark night, and the the cricket and the kettle are just making this sound all together. It's like a little symphony of joy, and they seem to be crying out, "Welcome home, welcome home, welcome home." And the one that is welcomed ultimately is Mr. Peerybingle, also known as John. He is a carrier, which I take to mean he is a delivery man, and he comes home for his dinner. He's a very large man. He's a large older man. His wife Dot is a small, petite little thing and quite a bit younger than him, but they're a good pair. Um, they tease each other. She says how, oh, I don't like it when you call me Dot, but she does. And then, she shows him she brings out the little child whom we hadn't seen prior to that, but their little baby, or their son, is very sweet and very precious. And she, again, she teases her husband saying like, oh, you're such a dunce, you can't touch the baby. And it's like, oh, but she's teasing him about it. And so they have a sweet little relationship, the husband and wife. They also have a dog named Boxer. He'll be a little character later on as well. There's a young lady named Tilly Slowboy who is she's an assistant. She's sort of like a nanny for the baby. And so she helps. Miss Slowboy is a little slow. It has a cute little description of how she sometimes bumps the baby's head against different things, but she's good natured, and she is herself an orphan who's been taken in by the family to work with them to help with their child. And that she's very fortunate herself, never having been raised in a loving home, having been in an orphanage, to be able to be with the Peerybingles, with Dot and with John, to help raise their son. And so they're a happy little couple, and they talk about how the sound of the cricket just provides this extra little joy. And the Dot says how the cricket brings good fortune. And there's a little footnote at the end of the book where the editor says how a singing cricket in the house is considered to be good luck in a number of cultures. Traditionally, crickets have even been kept in small cages to prevent luck from escaping the house. And so the wife is saying it's a very lucky, fun thing to have the cricket in the house. And she says, too, how in the beginning, when they were married about a year prior, she heard that cricket the first night she came back to the home that they now share. And that, when she was scared that maybe she wouldn't be a good wife, maybe that he wouldn't love her, maybe they wouldn't suit with each other, the cricket seemed to cheer her and say, no, it's going to be okay. And that sometimes when he was at work and she was lonely, the cricket would seem to say, no, it's okay. There'll be another voice. And there was. They had a child together, and now her joy is complete. And she also says too, she was so much younger than John when they were married, and that she was worried that maybe he wouldn't be able to learn to love her. And the cricket also seemed to say, be cheered, it's okay, it'll be all right. And John, of course, protests it. He never did need to learn to love her after they were married. He had loved her before. So again, a very sweet, sweet setting. They're a nice young couple, or a nice couple, even though he's older than she. They get on well together. And so where our scene that we read yesterday was drawing to a close, was that she looked through some of the things that he had. And one of the deliveries that he has is a box that will be a wedding cake. And it turns out that there's going to be a wedding by somebody, a toy maker, whom they refer to as Gruff and Tackleton. And we'll learn a bit more of him in today's reading. But the wife, Dot, is concerned. There's something about this news that concerns her. And she mentions how she went to school with her. We presume that is going to be the fiance of the toy maker. And that she's concerned that she says like, oh, he's so unlike her, and he's so much older. In fact, he's older than you are, so again, this other fiance would be the same age as Dot, and Dot's own husband, John, even though they get along well, he's quite a bit older, but she's saying Gruff and Tackleton is even older than John. And so Dot is expressing concerns that perhaps this isn't the right pair for the right, spouse for her friend. And it says too that she's just sort of absorbed in her thoughts while John is eating his meal. And eventually she does laugh, but it is not the same laugh that she had before. The manner and the music were quite changed, and that the cricket too had stopped. And somehow the room was not so cheerful as it had been, nothing like it. And so we don't exactly know why at this point that she has these misgivings about the marriage of her friend, her schoolmate, and this toy maker. Other than that, he's older, which shouldn't necessarily be something that would automatically turn her off because her own husband is so much older. So there's something else yet that we will learn, I'm sure. All right, let's go ahead and continue. Today we'll conclude Chirp the First of The Cricket on the Hearth. I'm going to just read that last little sentence again just to help us transition into the next section. All right, so let's go back actually 2 sentences. Absorbed in thought, she stood there, heedless alike of the tea and John, although he called to her and rapped the table with his knife to startle her, until he rose and touched her on the arm, when she looked at him for a moment and hurried to her place behind the tea-board, laughing at her negligence. But not as she had laughed before. The manner and the music were quite changed. The cricket, too, had stopped. Somehow the room was not so cheerful as it had been. Nothing like it. "So these are all the parcels, are they, John?" she said, breaking a long silence, which the honest carrier had devoted to the practical illustration of one part of his favorite sentiment, certainly enjoying what he ate, if it couldn't be admitted that he ate but little. "So these are all the parcels, are they, John?" "That's all," said John. "Why, no, laying down his knife and fork and taking a long breath, "I declare, I've clean forgotten the old gentleman." "The old gentleman?" "In the cart," said John. "He was asleep among the straw the last time I saw him. I very nearly remembered him twice since I came in, but he went out of my head again. Hello! Yahip there! Rouse up! There's my hearty." John said these latter words outside the door, whither he had hurried with the candle in his hand. Miss Slowboy, conscious of some mysterious reference to "the old gentleman," and connecting in her mystified imagination certain associations of a religious nature with the phrase, was so disturbed that, hastily rising from the low chair by the fire to seek protection near the skirts of her mistress, and coming into contact as she crossed the doorway with an ancient stranger, she instinctively made a charge or butt at him with the only offensive instrument within her reach. This instrument happening to be the baby, great commotion and alarm ensued, which the sagacity of Boxer rather tended to increase; for that good dog, more thoughtful than its master, had, it seemed, been watching the old gentleman in his sleep, lest he should walk off with a few young poplar trees that were tied up behind the cart. And he still attended on him very closely, worrying his gaiters, in fact, and making dead sets at the buttons. "You're such an undeniable good sleeper, sir," said John, when tranquillity was restored. In the meantime the old gentleman had stood, bareheaded and motionless, in the centre of the room, "that I have half a mind to ask you where the other 6 are. Only that would be a joke, and I know I should spoil it." "Very near, though," murmured the carrier with a chuckle. "Very near." The stranger, who had long white hair, good features, singularly bold and well defined for an old man, and dark, bright, penetrating eyes, looked round with a smile, and saluted the carrier's wife by gravely inclining his head. His garb was very quaint and old, a long, long way behind the time. Its hue was brown all over. In his hand he held a great brown club or walking stick, and striking this upon the floor, it fell asunder, and became a chair, on which he sat down quite composedly. "There," said the carrier, turning to his wife, "that's the way I found him, sitting by the roadside, upright as a milestone, and almost as deaf." "Sitting in the open air, John?" "In the open air," replied the carrier, "just at dusk. 'Carriage paid,' he said, and gave me 18 pence. Then he got in, and there he is." "He is going, John, I think." "Not at all. He was only going to speak." "If you please, I was to be left till called for," said the stranger, mildly. "Don't mind me." With that, he took a pair of spectacles from one of his large pockets and a book from another, and leisurely began to read, making no more of Boxer than if he had been a house lamb. The carrier and his wife exchanged a look of perplexity. The stranger raised his head, and glancing from the latter to the former, said, "Your daughter, my good friend?" "Wife," returned John. "Niece?" said the stranger. "Wife!" roared John. "Indeed," observed the stranger. "Surely very young." He quietly turned over and resumed his reading. But before he could have read 2 lines, he again interrupted himself to say, "Baby, yours?" John gave him a gigantic nod, equivalent to an answer in the affirmative, delivered through a speaking trumpet. "Girl?" "Boy!" roared John. "Also very young, eh?" Mrs. Peerybingle instantly struck in. 2 months and 3 days! Vaccinated just 6 weeks ago! Took very finely! Considered by the doctor a remarkably beautiful child! Equal to the general run of children at 5 months old! Takes notice in a way quite wonderful! May seem impossible to you, but feels his legs already." Here the breathless little mother, who had been shrieking these short sentences into the old man's ear until her pretty face was crimsoned, held up the baby before him as a stubborn and triumphant fact, while Tilly's slow boy, with a melodious cry of "Catcher, catcher," which sounded like some unknown words adapted to a popular sneeze, performed some cow-like gambols round that all unconscious innocent. "Hark! He's called for, sure enough," said John. "There's somebody at the door. Open it, Tilly." Before she could reach it, however, it was opened from without, being a primitive sort of door, with a latch, that anyone could lift if he chose. And a good many people did choose, for all kinds of neighbors liked to have a cheerful word or two with the carrier, though he was no great talker himself. Being opened, it gave admission to a little, meagre, thoughtful, dingy-faced man, who seemed to have made himself a greatcoat from the sackcloth covering of some old box, for when he turned to shut the door and keep the weather out, he disclosed upon the back of that garment the inscription G and T in large black capitals, also the word glass in bold characters. "Good evening, John," said the little man. "Good evening, Mum." "Good evening, Tilly." "Good evening, unbeknown." "How's baby, Mum?" "Boxer's pretty well, I hope." "All thriving, Caleb," replied Dot. "I am sure you need only look at the dear child for one to know that." "And I'm sure I need only look at you for another," said Caleb. He didn't look at her, though. He had a wandering and thoughtful eye which seemed to be always projecting itself into some other time and place, no matter what he said, a description which will equally apply to his voice. "Or at John for another," said Caleb. "Or at Tilly, as far as that goes. Or certainly at Boxer." "Busy just now, Caleb?" asked the carrier. "Why, pretty well, John," he replied, with the distraught air of a man who has been casting about for the philosopher's stone, at least. "Pretty much so. There's rather a run on Noah's arks at present. I could have wished to improve upon the family, but I don't see how it's to be done at the price. It would be a satisfaction to one's mind to make it clearer which was Shems and Hams, and which was wives. Flies ain't on that scale neither, as compared with elephants, you know. Ah, well, have you got anything in the parcel line for me, John?" The carrier put his hand into a pocket of the coat he had taken off, and brought out, carefully preserved in moss and paper, a tiny flower pot. "There it is," he said, adjusting it with great care. "Not so much as a leaf damaged. Full of buds." Caleb's dull eye brightened as he took it and thanked him. "Dear Caleb," said the carrier. "Very dear at this season." "Never mind that. It would be cheap to me, whatever it cost, returned the little man. Anything else, John? A small box, replied the carrier. Here you are. For Caleb Plummer, said the little man, spelling out the direction, with cash. With cash, John? I don't think it's for me. With care, returned the carrier, looking over his shoulder. Where do you make out cash? Oh, to be sure, said Caleb. It's all right. With care. Yes, yes, that's mine. It might have been with cash indeed if my dear boy in the golden South Americas had lived, John. You loved him like a son, didn't you? You needn't say you did. I know, of course. Caleb Plummer, with care. Yes, yes, it's all right. It's a box of doll's eyes for my daughter's work. I wish it was her own sight in a box, John. I wish it was, or could be, cried the carrier. Thank'ee, said the little man. You speak very hearty. To think that she should never see the dolls, and them a staring at her so bold all day long. That's where it cuts. What's the damage, John? I'll damage you, said John, if you inquire. Dot. Very near. Well, it's like you to say so, observed the little man. It's your kind way. Let me see. I think that's all. I think not, said the carrier. Try again. Something for our governor, eh? Said Caleb, after pondering a little while. To be sure, that's what I came for, but my head's so running on them arks and things. He hasn't been here, has he? Not he, returned the carrier. He's too busy courting. He's coming round, though, said Caleb, for he told me to keep on the near side of the road going home, and it was 10 to 1 he'd take me up. I had better go, by the by. You couldn't have the goodness to let me pinch Boxer's tail, Mum, for half a moment, could you? Why, Caleb, what a question! Oh, never mind, Mum, said the little man. He mightn't like it, perhaps. There's a small order just come in for barking dogs, and I should wish to go as close to nature as I could for sixpence. That's all. Never mind, Mum. It happened opportunely that Boxer, without receiving the proposed stimulus, began to bark with great zeal. But, as this implied the approach of some new visitor, Caleb, postponing his study from the life to a more convenient season, shouldered the round box and took a hurried leave. He might have spared himself the trouble, for he met the visitor upon the threshold. Oh, you are here, are you? Wait a bit. I'll take you home. John Peerybingle, my service to you. More of my service to your pretty wife. Handsomer every day. Better, too, if possible. And younger, mused the speaker in a low voice. That's the devil of it. I should be astonished at your paying compliments, Mr. Tackleton, said Dot, not with the best grace in the world, but for your condition. You know all about it, then. I have got myself to believe it somehow, said Dot. After a hard struggle, I suppose? Very. Tackleton the toy merchant, pretty generally known as Gruff and Tackleton, for that was the firm, though Gruff had been bought out long ago, only leaving his name, and, as some said, his nature, according to its dictionary meaning, in the business. Tackleton the toy merchant was a man whose vocation had been quite misunderstood by his parents and guardians. If they had made him a money lender, or a sharp attorney, or a sheriff's officer, or a broker, he might have sown his discontented oats in his youth, and after having had the full run of himself in ill-natured transactions, might have turned out amiable at last for the sake of a little freshness and novelty. But, cramped and chafing in the peaceable pursuit of toy-making, he was a domestic ogre who had been living on children all his life, and was their implacable enemy. He despised all toys. Wouldn't have bought one for the world. delighted in his malice to insinuate grim expressions into the faces of brown paper farmers who drove pigs to market, bellmen who advertised lost lawyers' consciences, movable old ladies who darned stockings or carved pies, and other like samples of his stock in trade. In appalling masks, hideous, hairy, red-eyed jacks in boxes, vampire kites, demonical tumblers who wouldn't lie down and were perpetually flying forward to stare infants out of countenance, his soul perfectly reveled. They were his only relief and safety valve. He was great in such inventions. Anything suggestive of a pony nightmare was delicious to him. He had even lost money, and he took to that toy very kindly, by getting up goblin slides for magic lanterns, whereon the powers of darkness were depicted as a sort of supernatural shellfish with human faces. In intensifying the portraiture of giants, he had sunk quite a little capital, and though no painter himself, he could indicate for the instruction of his artists, with a piece of chalk, a certain furtive leer for the countenances of those monsters, which was safe to destroy the peace of mind of any young gentleman between the ages of 6 and 11, for the whole Christmas or midsummer vacation. What he was in toys, he was, as most men are, in other things. You may easily suppose, therefore, that within the great green cape, which reached down to the calves of his legs, there was buttoned up to the chin an uncommonly pleasant fellow, and that he was about as choice a spirit and as agreeable a companion as ever stood in a pair of bull-headed looking boots with mahogany-colored tops. Still, Tackleton the toy merchant was going to be married. In spite of all this, he was going to be married. And to a young wife, too. A beautiful young wife. He didn't look much like a bridegroom as he stood in the carrier's kitchen with a twist in his dry face and a screw in his body, and his hat jerked over the bridge of his nose, and his hands tucked down into the bottoms of his pockets, and his whole sarcastic, ill-conditioned self peering out of one little corner of one little eye, like the concentrated essence of any number of ravens. But a bridegroom he designed to be. In 3 days' time, next Thursday, the last day of the first month in the year. That's my wedding day, said Tackleton. Did I mention that he had always one eye wide open and one eye nearly shut, and that the one eye nearly shut was always the expressive eye? I don't think I did. That's my wedding day, said Tackleton, rattling his money. Why, why, it's our wedding day, too, exclaimed the carrier. Ha ha, laughed Tackleton. Odd. You're just such another couple. Just. The indignation of Dot at this presumptuous assertion is not to be described. What next? His imagination would compass the possibility of just such another baby, perhaps. The man was mad. I say, a word with you, murmured Tackleton, nudging the carrier with his elbow and taking him a little apart. You'll come to the wedding? We're in the same boat, you know. How in the same boat? Inquired the carrier. A little disparity, you know, said Tackleton, with another nudge. Come and spend an evening with us, beforehand. Why? Demanded John, astonished at this pressing hospitality. Why? Returned the other. That's a new way of receiving an invitation. Why, for pleasure, sociability, you know, and all that. I thought you were never sociable, said John, in his plain way. Tcha! It's of no use to be anything but free with you, I see, said Tackleton. Why, then, the truth is you have what tea-drinking people call a sort of a comfortable appearance together, you and your wife. We know better, you know, but... No, we don't know better, interposed John. What are you talking about? Well, We don't know better then, said Tackleton. We'll agree that we don't. As you like. What does it matter? I was going to say, as you have that sort of appearance, your company will produce a favorable effect on Mrs. Tackleton, that will be. And though I don't think your good lady's very friendly to me, in this matter, still she can't help herself from falling into my views, for there's a compactness and coziness of appearance about her that always tells, even in an indifferent case. You say you'll come? We have arranged to keep our wedding day, as far as that goes, at home, said John. We have made the promise to ourselves these 6 months. We think, you see, that home— Bah! cried Tackleton. Excuse me. Bah! What's home? Cried Tackleton. 4 walls and a ceiling. Why don't you kill that cricket? I would. I always do. I hate their noise. There are 4 walls and a ceiling at my house. Come to me. You kill your crickets, eh? Said John. Scrunch 'em, sir, returned the other, setting his heel heavily on the floor. You'll say you'll come? It's as much your interest as mine, you know, that the women should persuade each other that they're quiet and contented and couldn't be better off. I know their way. Whatever one woman says, another woman is determined to clinch, always. There's that spirit of emulation among 'em, sir, that if your wife says to my wife, I'm the happiest woman in the world, and mine's the best husband in the world, and I dote on him, my wife will say the same to yours, or more, and half believe it. Do you mean to say she don't, then? Asked the carrier. Don't? Cried Tackleton with a short, sharp laugh. Don't what? The carrier had some faint idea of adding, dote upon you, but happening to meet the half-closed eye as it twinkled upon him over the turned-up collar of the cape, which was within an ace of poking it out, he felt it such an unlikely part and parcel of anything to be doted on that he substituted, that she don't believe it? Ah, you dog! You're joking, said Tackleton. But the carrier, though slow to understand the full drift of his meaning, eyed him in such a serious manner that he was obliged to be a little more explanatory. I have the humor, said Tackleton, holding up the fingers of his left hand and tapping the forefinger to imply, there I am, Tackleton, to wit. I have the humor, sir, to marry a young wife, and a pretty wife. Here he rapped his little finger to express the bride, not sparingly, but sharply, with a sense of power. I'm able to gratify that humor, and I do. It's my whim. But, now, look here. He pointed to where Dot was sitting, thoughtfully, before the fire, leaning her dimpled chin upon her hand, and watching the bright blaze. The carrier looked at her, and then at him, and then at her, and then at him again. She honors and obeys, no doubt, you know, said Tackleton, and that, as I am not a man of sentiment, is quite enough for me. But do you think there's anything more in it? I think, observed the carrier, that I should chuck any man out of window who said there wasn't. Exactly so, returned the other with an unusual alacrity of assent. To be sure, doubtless you would. Of course I'm certain of it. Good night, pleasant dreams. The carrier was puzzled and made uncomfortable and uncertain in spite of himself. He couldn't help showing it in his manner. Good night, my dear friend, said Tackleton compassionately. I'm off. We're exactly alike in reality, I see. You won't give us tomorrow evening? Well, next day you go out visiting, I know. I'll meet you there and bring my wife that is to be. It'll do her good. You're agreeable? Thank'ee. What's that? It was a loud cry from the carrier's wife, a loud, sharp, sudden cry that made the room ring like a glass vessel. She had risen from her seat and stood like one transfixed by terror and surprise. The stranger had advanced towards the fire to warm himself and stood within a short stride of her chair, but quite still. "Dot!" cried the carrier. "Mary! Darling! What's the matter?" They were all about her in a moment. Caleb, who had been dozing on the cake box in the first imperfect recovery of his suspended presence of mind, seized Miss Slowboy by the hair of her head, but immediately apologized. "Mary!" exclaimed the carrier, supporting her in his arms. "Are you ill? What is it? Tell me, dear." She only answered by beating her hands together and falling into a wild fit of laughter. Then, sinking from his grasp upon the ground, she covered her face with her apron and wept bitterly. And then she laughed again, and then she cried again, and then she said how cold it was, and suffered him to lead her to the fire, where she sat down as before, the old man standing as before, quite still. "I'm better, John," she said. "I'm quite well now. John!" But John was on the other side of her. Why turn her face toward the strange old gentleman, as if addressing him? Was her brain wandering? "Only a fancy, dear John. Only a fancy, John dear. A kind of shock. Something coming suddenly before my eyes. I don't know what it was. It's quite gone. Quite gone." "I'm glad it's gone," muttered Tackleton, turning the expressive eye all round the room. "I wonder where it's gone and what it was. Humph! Caleb, come here. Who's that with the gray hair?" "I don't know, sir," returned Caleb in a whisper. "Never see him before in all my life. A beautiful figure for a nutcracker. Quite a new model, with a screw jar opening down into his waistcoat. He'd be lovely." "Not ugly enough," said Tackleton. "Or for a firebox either," observed Caleb in deep contemplation. "What a model! Unscrew his head to put the matches in, turn him heels upwards for the light, and what a firebox for a gentleman's mantel-shelf, just as he stands." "Not half ugly enough," said Tackleton. "Nothing in him at all. Come, bring that box. All right now, I hope?" "Oh, quite gone, quite gone," said the little woman, waving him hurriedly away. "Good night." "Good night," said Tackleton. "Good night, John Peerybingle. Take care how you carry that box, Caleb. Let it fall, and I'll murder you. Dark as pitch, and weather worse than ever, eh? Good night." So, with another sharp look around the room, he went out at the door, followed by Caleb with the wedding cake on his head. The carrier had been so much astounded by his little wife, and so busily engaged in soothing and tending her, that he had scarcely been conscious of the stranger's presence, until now, when he again stood there, their only guest. "He don't belong to them, you see," said John. "I must give him a hint to go." "I beg your pardon, friend," said the old man, advancing to him, "the more so as I fear your wife has not been well, but the attendant whom my infirmity," he touched his ears and shook his head, "renders almost indispensable, not having arrived, I fear there must be some mistake. The bad night which made the shelter of your comfortable cart, may I never have a worse, so acceptable, is still as bad as ever. Would you, in your kindness, suffer me to rent a bed here?" "Yes, yes," cried Dot. "Yes, certainly." "Oh," said the carrier, surprised by the rapidity of this consent. "Well, I don't object, but still I'm not quite sure that—" "Hush!" she interrupted. "Dear John." "Why, he's stone deaf," urged John. "I know he is, but—" "Yes, sir, certainly. Yes, certainly. I'll make him up a bed directly, John." As she hurried off to do it, the flutter of her spirits and the agitation of her manner were so strange that the carrier stood looking after her, quite confounded. Did its mothers make it up of beds, then? Cried Miss Slowboy to the baby. And did its hair grow brown and curly when its caps was lifted off to frighten it? A precious pets, a sitting by the fires? With that unaccountable attraction of the mind to trifles, which is often incidental to a state of doubt and confusion, the carrier, as he walked slowly to and fro, found himself mentally repeating even these absurd words many times. So many times that he got them by heart and was still conning them over and over, like a lesson, when Tilly, after administering as much friction to the little bald head with her hand as she thought wholesome, according to the practice of nurses, had once more tied the baby's cap on. And frighten it, a precious pets, a sitting by the fires. What frightened Dot, I wonder, mused the carrier, pacing to and fro. He scouted from his heart the insinuations of the toy master, and yet they filled him with a vague, indefinite uneasiness. For Tackleton was quick and sly, and he had that painful sense himself of being a man of slow perception, that a broken hint was always worrying to him. He certainly had no intention he certainly had no intention in his mind of linking anything that Tackleton had said with the unusual conduct of his wife. But the two subjects of reflection came into his mind together, and he could not keep them asunder. The bed was soon made ready, and the visitor, declining all refreshment but a cup of tea, retired. Then Dot, quite well again, she said, quite well again, arranged the great chair in the chimney corner for her husband, filled his pipe and gave it him, and took her usual little stool beside him on the hearth. She always would sit on that little stool. I think she must have had a kind of notion that it was a coaxing, wheedling little stool. She was out and out the very best filler of a pipe, I should say, in the 4 quarters of the globe. To see her put that chubby little finger in the bowl and then blow down the pipe to clear the tube, and when she had done so, affect to think that there was really something in the tube, and blow 12 times and hold it to her eye like a telescope, with a most provoking twist in her capital little face as she looked down it, was quite a brilliant thing. As to the tobacco, she was perfect mistress of the subject, and her lighting of the pipe with a wisp of paper, when the carrier had it in his mouth, going so very near his nose and yet not scorching it, was art, high art. And the cricket and the kettle, turning up again, acknowledged it. The bright fire, blazing up again, acknowledged it. The little mower on the clock, in his unheeded work, acknowledged it. The carrier, in his smoothing forehead and expanding face, acknowledged it, the readiest of all. And as he soberly and thoughtfully puffed at his old pipe, and as the Dutch clock and as the Dutch clock ticked, and as the red fire gleamed, and as the cricket chirped, that genius of his hearth and home, for such the cricket was, came out in fairy shape into the room, and summoned many forms of home about him. Dots of all ages and all sizes filled the chamber. Dots who were merry children, running on before him, gathering flowers in their fields. Coy Dots, half shrinking from, half yielding to, the pleading of his own rough image. Newly married Dots, alighting at the door and taking wondering possession of the household keys. Motherly little Dots, attended by fictitious slow boys, bearing babies to be christened. Matronly Dots, still young and blooming, watching dots of daughters as they danced at rustic balls. Fat Dots, encircled and beset by troops of rosy grandchildren. Withered Dots, who leaned on sticks and tottered as they crept along. Old carriers, too, appeared, with blind old boxers lying at their feet, and newer carts with younger drivers, Peerybingle brothers on the tilt, and sick old carriers, tended by the gentlest hands, and graves of dead and gone old carriers, green in the churchyard. And as the cricket showed him all these things, he saw them plainly, though his eyes were fixed upon the fire. The carrier's heart grew light and happy, and he thanked his household gods with all his might, and cared no more for Gruff and Tackleton than you do. But what was that young figure of a man, which the same fairy cricket set so near her stool, and which remained there, singly and alone? Why did it linger still, so near her, with its arm upon the chimney-piece, ever repeating, "Married, and not to me"? Oh, Dot! Oh, failing Dot! There is no place for it in all your husband's visions. Why has its shadow fallen on his hearth? Okay, that concludes Chirp the First. We'll continue with Chirp the Second tomorrow. We'll find out more about what does it mean that there is this mysterious vision of a young man who laments somebody being married to someone who is not him. Let us learn more tomorrow. Thank you very much for joining me today. And again, if you have not yet voted as to what we'll read next, I encourage you to go onto our SCPL Tea with Dickens in December page and go ahead and vote for the book that you would like to read next. Take care, friends. I'll see you next time. Bye.